Tonight on All 24 News, the fragile Trump-Iran truce faces a trial by fire. As of today, June 25, 2026, the global order is wrestling with a profound reality check. Washington hardliners are moving to block the implementation of oil waivers, while Tel Aviv launches deep kinetic strikes into Syria and Lebanon, openly defying the ceasefire and calling it anticipatory self-defense. The primary question reverberating through global capitals tonight is no longer if the Western-led rules-based order is collapsing, but how catastrophically it will unravel as the reckless combination of unconditional U.S. military shielding and Israeli operational exceptionalism backfired so spectacularly that it has permanently shattered the credibility of Western deterrence. We mapped the geopolitical wreckage of a 110-day war that Washington could neither win nor successfully contain. Good evening and welcome. I'm Islam Said, anchoring this special edition of All 24 News. To dissect the fracturing of Western hegemony and the legal crisis gripping the international system, I'm joined by a highly distinguished panel of global scholars and analysts. We start with Ms. Yelena Novakov, a journalist and geopolitical analyst from Belgrade. Thank you for being here with us, Ms.
Thank you for having me on.
The pleasure is ours. And we have also Professor Tahir Abbas, Professor of Criminology and Global Justice in Austin University in Birmingham in the United Kingdom. Thank you for being here with us, sir.
Thank you for having me.
And also we have Dr. Hussein Fetni, Professor of Law and Society at the University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia in the United States. Great to have you with us, sir. And also we have Mr. Hamid Jabri, Middle East analyst and researcher from Tehran, who's going to later join us in the debate. And to start our debate, let me start with you, Dr. Fetni. Looking closely at the legislative panic currently unfolding in Washington, pro-Israel hardliners in Congress are attempting to legally freeze the administration's promised oil waivers to Iran. This highlights a glaring paradox. The U.S. routinely uses international law as an imperial weapon of convenience, yet completely subverts its own international agreements when domestic lobby groups object. As the weaponization of the American legal apparatus against foreign sovereigns effectively destroyed the very concept of international contract sanctity. Dr. Fetni, can you turn on the mic, sir?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Sorry for that. Yeah. Let me just start by saying that the memorandum of understanding that is made between the United States and Iran, from a legal perspective, it's really not binding, okay? However, the parties use it basically to share their goals in this context, basically to end the conflict. So if we really want to talk about the legality, if we mean really to hold the parties legally to a binding document, then we should really talk about a treaty. It's in that context that members of Congress were thinking of a treaty between the United States and Iran. But talking about memorandum of understanding from that perspective, it's not really binding. Now, in terms of international law, as I mentioned in this session, on this program previously, that international law has many branches. And unfortunately, the branch that deals with peace and war is very politicized. And it's in that context that is really mostly part of international politics and international relations. And nations in dealing with their foreign policy, they look more at their geopolitical interest. And it's in that context when the United States deals with this issue, it basically deals with it as just another foreign policy issue. And therefore, the various groups who have an interest in US foreign policy when it comes to the Middle East, they basically get involved and try to influence US foreign policy, including the various Jewish groups who have an interest in impacting US foreign policy when it comes to the Middle East. It's in that context, I would just argue that why not the other groups in the Middle East, such as the Gulf countries, why can't they also have an impact on US foreign policy? After all, as we all know, international relations is basically more about relationship of power. Relationship of power, influence. Power is about really the ability to influence. I mean, who has really the ability to influence more than, let's say, some of the Gulf countries? They have the ability to influence events in the Middle East. They have the ability to influence US foreign policy in the Middle East. Why can't they themselves also influence US foreign policy in the Middle East, same as the other groups here? So in a sense, when we really talk about US foreign policy towards the Middle East, it's really not about international law. Yes, we expect the United States, when it comes to international law, even though this is politicized, we think of the US as a country that should promote the rule of law, democracy, and all that. But let's face it, the United States has its own geopolitical interest. And when it makes decisions in terms of foreign policy, everything is possible. Various players, various groups can influence this. And therefore, my point is, why can't other groups, including the Middle Eastern groups, such as the Gulf countries, since they have a power over the United States, they can also be engaged and impact US foreign policy to their advantage or to the advantage of the Palestinian cause. And that's basically what it is. Thank you.
Okay. Let me turn to Ms. Novakov here. European capitals, Ms., are privately furious. The previous energy shock from the 110-day blockade already claimed the political life of the British government under Keir Starmer. Now, as the United States struggles to keep its own client state, Israel, from blowing up the Swiss Memorandum of Understanding through continued operations in Lebanon, Europeans, or Europe in general, remains economically exposed. Does this crisis prove that relying on a volatile, Washington-centric security architecture is a form of a strategic suicide for Europe?
Well, first, regarding Starmer, he won in a landslide, but became really unpopular really quickly due to a plethora of domestic issues, but also his inaction regarding foreign policy. Now, what also didn't help is banning Palestinian action and then putting its activists on trial for terrorism. I mean, that was especially unpopular with his own labor, right? But now regarding the United States and Europe, we're witnessing a deepening chasm between the two sides of the Atlantic. And there are several major points of contention. There are issues regarding Ukraine and Europe's ability to defend itself and its allies. Obviously, that includes Ukraine as well. So we have witnessed last year during the NATO summit, Trump asking the European allies to increase defense spending to 5% of their state budget, right? And so we're probably going to see a further push now in July during the next summit, and there is probably going to be some form of retaliation for major European nations because Trump was highly dissatisfied with their refusal to follow him into this war in Iran, even though several European countries have opened their airspaces for military operations of the United States. I think in Europe that there is truly a disconnect between their responsibility for certain things that are happening now in Europe and that have been happening for over a decade now, because they chose to follow the United States into their military operations in the Middle East. A great example of that is the migrant crisis, right? That peaked in 2015, but that is still going on and it's expanding. Had Europe not followed America, or let's say the most prominent European NATO member countries, had they not followed America into Iraq, there would be no ISIS, or there would be no migrant crisis to that extent where European countries, and I'm talking about all European countries, are now paying the price for poor choices of the few. There was another major point of contention about Greenland, right, where Trump decided to threaten their own allies. So everyone in Europe was shocked because it was the first time that, oh my God, now it's us being threatened by our major ally, and we have been relying on them for decades at this point, and we have no way of defending ourselves. So this relationship between Europe and the United States is definitely worsening. Now, whether it will be able to kind of hold on by a thread until Trump finishes his term and improve with the next administration, if it's democratic, that is very likely. I don't think there will be an interruption in alliance between the United States and Europe, but I think European officials are now aware that Europe has to learn to stand on its own and not rely on the United States.
Mm-hmm. Which leads me now to Professor Tahir Abbas. Professor Abbas, from the perspective of global justice, the international community is witnessing a profound double standard. The moment an adversarial state acts, it is branded a rogue entity. Yet when the United States and Israel, for example, launched devastating unilateral strikes that paralyze regional economies and inflict massive civilian tolls, it is framed as defense. Looking through the lens of state crime, has the Western defense establishment permanently lost the moral authority to define what constitutes global stability and what constitutes terrorism?
Well, international law is not applied uniformly. It is activated selectively, essentially. For example, missile strikes, economic sabotage, civilian casualties, it's judged by two entirely different categories, depending on who gave the order. And one state's defense is another state's rogue aggression. The legal fact of the act remains identical. There's also the general idea of when we think about the definition of terrorism, i.e. who gets to apply it, and who it then gets applied to. And it's less a legal category rather than a discursive technology. And states that dominate the UN Security Council, the ICC's funding streams, and the global media infrastructure also control dictionary, just violence. So the problem is that this whole moral authority is not just simply lost through these recent scandals. It has been eroding when there's the gap between the proclaimed principle and the practiced exception. And in current periods, it's just become too large to ignore. And then ultimately we have this question of the legitimacy deficit in the global order. These rules are selective, not universal, they're instruments of power. And this enforcement is asymmetrical, doesn't constrain power. This enforcement effectively launders it. So, it's not a question of whether this was lawful, it's who owns the institution themselves, and what this lawfulness therefore means. And so what does this mean for the international rules-based order? Well, it was established in the post-war period in order to never let it happen again. But we see that it is also potentially or essentially signed in the interest of those who got to develop it in that moment in recent history for the vested interest of those who took closest part of its formation. And the rest of the world was seen as an instrument in its wide design, and we're now seeing it played out in the most starkest of terms, in the most unequal and the most unjust and unfair of ways that I've found.
Mm-hmm. Let me join now by, or let us join by Dr. or Mr. Hamid Jabri. Mr. Jabri, hardline U.S. think tanks are calling this memorandum of understanding a total capitulation to Tehran, pointing out to that the axis of resistance, for example, remains fully intact, while billions in assets are being unfrozen up front. So from Tehran's perspective, did the 110-day conflict prove that Western military dominance is largely a paper tiger when confronted by a deeply integrated, asymmetric, if we can call it, regional network that is perfectly willing to take a superpower to the brink?
Thank you for having me. Let me before just complete your first sentence. It wasn't just the hardline think tank that need to talk about the surrender or blunder or terms like this about the memorandum of understanding. There is a consensus among the majority of the scientific community, political scientists, and international relations theorists, like if you have seen John Mearsheimer or Robert Pape, they are telling that and even the majority of the other political scientists are telling that the America lost this war. In addition, the Republicans and the Democrats are considering this MOU as a failure. So therefore, seeing this MOU as a failure, as surrender, blunder, or something like this with this literature is bipartisan. You can see almost no one, no politicians, no think tanks, no school, no universities, no professors telling that this is a victory for the United States of America. But in terms of Tehran's perspective, I see that the fear of a U.S. military attack has subsided because the Iranian military elite has been avoiding confrontation with a superpower like the U.S., the first #1 army in the world for decades, by taking hostility with Israel and the United States in the gray zone. But the mentality of this elite, the military commanders, specifically the commanders of the IRGC, has really changed regarding the U.S. military power. So they are no longer seeing the United States military power and the confrontation with it as at least as cautious as before. And finally, I can say that it should be noted that Iran even did not use the card of closing the Bab al-Mandab Strait and the active presence of Ansarullah in the war. So all in all, it was definitely a failure. If you see the Memorandum of Understanding, it has 14 clauses. Except reopening the Strait of Hormuz, the other 13 clauses are all in favor of the Iranian government.
Let me go back to you, Dr. Hussein Fatni. Let's take a look at the constitutional crisis underlying this war here. Trump launched these military operations without congressional authorization, suffered massive economic blowback, and has now signed a sweeping deal via back channels in Qatar and Pakistan. When a superpower's foreign policy is dictated by erratic executive actions rather than systematic legal processes, doesn't it reduce American foreign policy to an unpredictable global protection racket?
That is unfortunately a question that describes the reality of today's America. The founding fathers of the United States made it very clear that only Congress can declare war. Of course, in case of emergency, the president can go to war, but then Congress need to be notified. Then when we really look at the war with Iran, that was really not an emergency. The founding fathers in our Constitution made it very clear that any action that requires spending funds, money, I mean, this is really for your audience to understand the American Constitution, that any action that requires funding, it's just for Congress to decide. And of course, when you get engaged in a war, war requires funding. When we look at this war that the United States was engaged in with Iran, we're talking really about billions and billions of dollars that were spent. We're talking about minimum of 30 billion that were spent. It's in that context that the Constitution made it very clear that the power of the purse is exclusively for Congress to decide. Okay, that is really the reality. The other thing is now President Trump now has realized that making peace is very, very difficult. However, starting a war was easy. And the other thing that we have discovered, and he has discovered, that this war is really, the ending of it is really taking us to the pre-status of the war, except that the consequences of this war are very dire, because this war has wreaked havoc on the global economy. It wreaked havoc on the US economy. It wreaked havoc on the global South. And what have we really gained from this war? I mean, even when we really look at this agreement, no one at this stage really understands what is really included in this agreement, okay? And that's why when the founding father gave the power for declaring a war to Congress, the belief is that because of the consequences of war, the belief is that a group is much wiser than one person. And that's basically how democracies work. Democracies work, they are led by a group rather than one person. Usually dictatorships are led by one person. Democracies are led by the people, by the group, and Congress represents the people. That's basically how we give an interpretation to our Constitution.
Let me move now to Professor Abbas. If we talk about the narratives of weaponizing the Islamophobia here, mainstream Western think tanks, Professor, are consistently utilized deeply racialized and Islamophobic tropes to frame Middle East states or Middle Eastern states as irrational actors incapable of classic deterrence. Yet throughout this war, it was Washington and Tel Aviv that acted on maximalist, highly ideological impulses, if we can call it, while Tehran operated with calculated, cold-blooded strategic patience. How does your research explain this psychological projection by Western elites who blame their strategic failures on the supposed irrationality of the global South?
These ideas in relation to the Middle East have been created, promoted, established, reaffirmed, reprojected, are centuries old now. They have their roots in the colonial era, which is all ideas of scientific racism, the idea of white race, the white man, savior complex, And then we see more recently these ideas of Orientalism, which is essentially all
I think we have a technical problem right now. Let me move now to Ms. Yelena Novakov. Ms. Yelena, the fact that this entire truce was brokered by Pakistan and Qatar, completely bypassing traditional European and G7 diplomatic channels, is a massive structural shift here. By over-focusing its military resources on a failed campaign to isolate Iran, has the Anglo-American alliance advertently accelerated its own displacement, leaving Switzerland as a mere venue for a Pax Eurasiana?
Both Pakistan and Qatar were in excellent positions to play this role of a mediator, given that they're Islamic countries, but also U.S. allies. And this is a much more natural role for them than it would be for any European countries or G7 countries in general. So this is perhaps one positive thing that came out of this new shift, the world order, if you will, because Europe is definitely losing relevance now after it was sidelined by the United States. And so Europe is also facing different problems, like facing far-right, I would say, extremists in the European Parliament. So not only is it has been sidelined by the United States, it's been threatened, and now its economic stability has been put in danger as well. So Europe is in this position where it's trying to rebuild and try to find its footing in this new order. There have been attempts by European leaders to kind of insert themselves into this story that has been going on in the Middle East now since 2023, including recently the French President Macron suggested that he would be willing to send ships to the Strait of Hormuz to monitor how it's opening. We've heard nothing of that, so I'm assuming that wasn't accepted. And just today, Macron and Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, stated that they provide security to Lebanon after the UN mission leaves. So as Europe is kind of now finding itself between Russia on one side and America on the other side, it's keeping its focus on Ukraine and also on the EU expansion, including on the Western Balkans, and trying to deter any potential threat from Russia, while also trying to lower energy dependency on Russia, because Europe is still partly dependent on Russian energy. And now the prices of energy have also skyrocketed, given that the Strait of Hormuz was closed due to American actions in Iran. And so we have this very large, what used to be superpower at least, now finding itself completely lost in between greater world powers, and without any actual effective measure to protect itself, even economically, and let alone militarily.
Mm-hmm. Let me now turn to Professor Tahir Abbas. Professor, we were talking about the Islamophobic narratives here based on your research. How does it, explain this psychological projection by the Western elites who blame their strategic failures on the, as we said, the supposed irrationality of the global South? And here we're talking about the, let's say, Middle Eastern states.
As apologies for the lost connection earlier. Essentially, what I was trying to emphasize is that Islamophobia is built on racism, Orientalism, scientific racism, white supremacism. The idea that somehow the West is the best, the Western European colonial project is entirely built on expansion and taking over other societies, extracting their wealth, and we see a continuation of that. And the way you legitimize that is to by claiming that what you are oppressing, taking over, taking advantage of is a resource, is an opportunity. is a market economy, and that you're civilizing the locals, providing them with sophistication that they would not otherwise have been able to achieve on their own. All of this is complete nonsense, and it's just post hoc justification for imperialist actions. And this is why we see this language proposed. This is why we see constant media misrepresentation of Islam and Muslims in the Middle East in particular, across Europe. It's hyper-normalized. Listen to other colleagues, the far right have occupied this space. We have the very large, very powerful AI tech social media companies that project, promote a certain kind of narrative, and it's often even embraced by certain governments because it helps them in many ways, and they don't really ask tough questions. And this completely misrecognizes the contribution of Muslim communities to European life, European culture, European norms, etc. So inevitably, this plays out in our popular discourses and in our media spheres in particular. And it seemingly then, for some people in society, legitimizes what is seen as irrational action on the part of states, but it's built on an historical set of factors that are deeply problematic and remain so. And they keep reinventing themselves. That's one of the things about racism. It has a way of reinventing itself. However, one tries to suppress it, fight against it. And there are often positive moments in history that allow us to do that. From time to time, various movements do occur, and we do see some social progress. But we sort of return to type. And I think the current period in our time, across the planet, we're seeing this huge imbalance playing out. And it really is a tipping point. And it's not clear exactly what happens next, but it's all built on this historical, ideational, opportunistic, exploitative tropes that continue to put in this.
Mr. Jabri, for decades, U.S. military strategy relied on the myth of shock and fear, the idea that overwhelming kinetic superiority could force any nation into submission. Iran absorbed months of these strikes, maintained its command and control structures, and successfully closed the world's most vital energy artery. Is the era of West dictating terms through the gunboat diplomacy officially dead?
Yes, I think this war was a great example of this diplomacy that used it. You know, before the election of Donald Trump to be the president, there was some talks that from the advisor of the national security that he has to pursue diplomacy with Iran through strength, diplomacy from the military power. So this war proves that this strategy doesn't work. I can remember before the war when news of the U.S. aircraft carrier like Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier or George W. Bush was in the Persian Gulf near the Iranian waters. Many analysts thought, and even some politicians thought that the Iranian revolution is finished, and Iran is not able to resist anymore. But let's just see the picture. We have two pictures here: before the war and after the war. This is the turning point. So before the war, we have to, if in order to have a correct assessment, I think we have to see both pictures at the same time. So before the war, there was negotiation on the table, but let's see what the Americans wanted from the Iranian part. Just compare them. On the negotiating table, the American side wanted the Iranian government just not talking about the nuclear issue. They say that they believe that not only in the nuclear issue, but also Iran's regional network, like supporting Hezbollah, supporting Yemenis, Ansarullah, and some Iraqi militias, and even Tehran's missile program, drone program, should be on the negotiating table. But if you see the memorandum of understanding, there is no points mentioning that issues. It's just talking about 60 days for talking about the nuclear issue. So we see that Iran now, after the war, clearly sees itself in a higher position, in a victory position than before the war. And I have to say that the perception among the Iranian military and specifically the political elite before the war even was that the American presidency, specifically Donald Trump, considered the military threat as a leverage. And I can say that this is not just about Donald Trump. Even Democrats like Joe Biden, like Barack Obama and Bush, they thought that the military threat is a leverage for negotiation and bargaining on some issue. And they always talked about the military option being on the table, just as a threat to the Iranian part to make some great concession. But now this option has been tested, the military option has been tested, and it failed. So we can see that in the near future there will be negotiation just on the nuclear issue. In return for the just lifting sanctions, even if you can see Donald Trump before the war talked about the Iranian government should not have uranium enrichment anymore, at any level, zero uranium enrichment. But now he says that it can have some level of enrichment. It says that Iran should limit to have great limitations on his missile program, drone program. But now he says that it is unfair not having missiles for the Iranian country. So you see how big is this shift? Undeniable.
Dr. Fatni, the UN Security Council was treated, if we can call it, was treated as useless or as entirely useless by Washington during the active phase of this war. Now that the United States needs international monitors from the IAEA to oversee the uranium downblending specified in the Memorandum of Understanding, it expects the global community to play along. Can international law survive when the world's primary superpower treats international institutions as a buffet, if we can call it, using them only when it needs a face-saving exit from a military blunder?
Excuse me. Look, the United States needs the UN. The global society needs the UN. Okay, we need the international institution. I think sometimes we take the United Nations, we take these global institutions for granted. Okay, now. How would we know that without the United Nations, probably we would have had a third world war? Okay. If we really reflect on the United States, I think the United States was one of the countries that benefited a lot from the United Nations and these international institutions. If we go back to history, we look at the United States, how the United States has used, for instance, the General Assembly in securing a resolution from the General Assembly in the 50s, United for Peace, to send peacekeeping forces to Korea. We can reflect how the United States, for instance, used the ICJ when Americans were taken hostage in Iran in 1917 with the overthrow of the Shah. And then we look at when we had the war, or when the Nicaragua, for instance, had a conflict with the United States regarding the mining of its internal water, and the United States refused to go to the ICJ and withdraw from the compulsory jurisdiction because the ICJ basically rendered judgment in favor of Nicaragua. So we have this love-hate relationship between the United States and the United Nations. So I think the United Nations, the Security Council, are essential. And I don't think we should really look at this period of time where there is this unilateralism from this administration and try to say that the international system does not really work or really is irrelevant, or look at this behavior from the US administration. I think the international system is needed. I think we have today a multipolar system. We have the global South, we have China, we have the European Union, we have Russia. What we really need today, we need a United Nations that requires and needs reform. We need a Security Council that should really give a voice to the third world, because that's really where the power of the United Nations is, in the Security Council. And that's where basically international law gets condemned, even though it's political, but that's where it gets condemned, because really, if you really have to think of the United Nations, the power is within the Security Council. And why we have these 5 members with the veto power? What we really need to do is change that veto power by giving these third world countries, giving them a voice. I think once we change that, then you're really gonna see this institution will have a significant role to play, but we cannot say that because of what's happening in this administration or the way this administration deals with the UN, then the UN really is relevant, or the Security Council is relevant. I think we need to reform this institution because they have worked, and without them, we cannot imagine what would really happen to this international community, because day in, day out, the various global institutions of the United Nations are working, and usually we really don't see the good that these institutions are doing around the globe.
Thank you. Point clear, Mr. Fatni. And now let me move to Ms. Yelena Novakov. Ms. Yelena, pro-Israel hardliners argue that Tel Aviv must maintain total operational freedom, regardless of what the United States signs in Switzerland. However, by continuing to bomb Lebanon and Syria, Israel is directly undermining Trump's domestic narrative of having brought peace. Has the United States created a monster, if we can call it, in its blind alliance with Israel, a client state that now possesses a functional veto over American global strategy? And be brief, please.
I think there is a prevailing narrative in American media and even in progressive independent media that was against the war, and it's obviously against Trump, that Israel somehow tricked America into wreaking havoc in the Middle East for decades, and that America is just now waking up. That's not true. America wasn't tricked. America was pursuing its own interests in the Middle East, thinking that it can have a partnership in doing that with Israel while still being at the top of that partnership. Now it's become really obvious that that's not the case, and Israel is an obvious threat to the Trump administration, even though the Trump administration has been the most lenient with the Netanyahu government, even though Israel wasn't exactly holding back during the Biden era or any previous administration either. There is a growing discontent within the Republican Party as well. A large percentage of Republican voters are not satisfied with the outcome of this war, didn't necessarily support the war. I'm not talking about MAGA extremists, right? I'm talking about regular Republican voters, even though they have all made a further shift to the right. But I think that is particularly noticeable with younger Republicans, and now with the midterm elections approaching, given the disastrous results for America in this war, I think it will cause the Republican Party, the Senate and the Congress. But I think the larger issue that is that is going to continue to perpetuate this power that Israel holds over Washington is this widespread legal lobbying and money in American politics. I mean, AIPAC isn't even registered as a foreign agent because technically it is run by Zionists in America, American Zionists, right? It completely disregards its obvious direct ties to Israel and how it's basically buying politicians into supporting Israel's agenda of creating greater Israel regardless of the consequences upon millions of people in that region. So I think as long as that is the case with money in politics, things aren't going to change significantly.
Thank you, Ms. Novakov. And one final question for Professor Abbas. Professor, the UK is experiencing unprecedented societal and political friction following the economic fallout of the Middle Eastern campaign, as public anger grows over crumbling domestic infrastructure while billions are wasted supporting foreign military adventures. Are we seeing the internal collapse of this social contract within the core states of Western imperialism?
Well, we're seeing significant challenges. The cost of the war has been significant in terms of the inflationary impact on prices in supermarkets. There's a lot of political disarray in terms of the Western responses to the Middle East crisis, what hasn't been done, or how late action has been taken, how disproportionate that action has been taken. We know the historical biases that Western Europe has in relation to Israeli action and not calling out the genocide when so much of the populations across Europe wanted it. We see the recent UN report which talks about children being targeted systematically as part of genocide. You know, we know facts with deeds. It's clear, and it's having a significant impact on the perception of citizens with regards to the states and how effective they are. We've seen the Prime Minister essentially collapse because of the wider impact of foreign policy failures. We saw that with Tony Blair when he came to Iraq. I think Gaza is a background issue that has impacted Keir Starmer and his decision, because he's seen as unelectable, and he might even severely lose the election in 2029, so he wants to change it now, find somebody else to put it. Social contract where we think about trust of the state that has waned across Europe for the last 25 years, because people don't feel they can trust their political masters, and are not being heard, they're not being followed through. These inequities are just growing.
Mr. Hamid Jabri, long story short, one last question for you. The United States' primary tool for global domination has long been the threat of total economic strangulation via secondary sanctions. Yet by building alternative trade routes with Russia, China and India, Iran survived both blockade and the sanctions regime. Has Tehran provided a definitive blueprint to the rest of the global South on how to permanently neutralize American economic blackmail?
Well, for now, I think it is difficult to talk about the end of the U.S. Economic blackmail, but the fear of the dollarization and the creation of other blocs, rival blocs like China, Russia, and even countries like Brazil has certainly increased. So, you know, just today, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that the dollar has been strengthened by the Iranian deal, by the lifting of sanctions on Iran, and this itself reflects their concern. So, and I think by looking east in Iranian foreign policy in recent years, especially by joining institutions like Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS, mainly, Iran has been able to neutralize some of the effects of the sanctions regime. Of course, here Iran has not been alone. Countries that are even not under sanctions regimes, such as Brazil, are also talking about the dollarization. And even in the Persian Gulf countries, such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, they have been joining BRICS, at the same time seeking strategic balance in their foreign policy. You have seen that they have comprehensive strategic treaties with China, with Russia, and they are doing that to have a diverse foreign policy. So therefore, ultimately, the confidence for the global South, I think, against the United States, against the West, and mainly with the leadership of the United States, has increased greatly. But with all of this, I think there is no easy road ahead.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Hamid Jabri. We must leave the debate there, unfortunately, as our time is up. My sincere thanks to our panel for a truly inspiring analysis. Yelena Novakov in Belgrade, Professor Tahar Abbas in Birmingham, Dr. Hussein Fitni in Philadelphia, and Mr. Hamid Jabri in Tehran. Tonight's discussion exposes the stark realities of changing global architecture 1 week after the Swiss Memorandum of Understanding. The cracks in the Western Alliance have widened into champs. From the legal gymnastics in Washington to the absolute failure of a kinetic deterrence in the Persian Gulf, the events of June 2026 have laid bare the exhaustion of imperial power. When client states dictate terms to superpowers and when regional actors replace traditional Western peace brokers, the old order isn't just shifting, it is being actively rewritten. Thank you for watching All 24 News. Good night.